Hi, I'm Bob Kelka with IBM Security, and I'd like to talk to you today about a fascinating topic, and that is how cybersecurity programs are modernizing. I think it's stating the obvious to point out that most organizations and their IT investments are migrating towards hybrid cloud and leveraging AI more. And that is creating some essential physics in the industry that are forcing cyber teams to modernize as well. So what we're going to talk about today is what exactly is going on with cyber modernization. Because cyber modernization is really occurring across two major areas right now. The first one is, how do you actually do threat management? So for most organizations, that would be, how do you run your security operations center or SOC? And the way most organizations do that today, it's pretty straightforward. It's not easy, of course, but it's pretty straightforward. Where everybody starts is that you start by making sure that you can detect threats and then that you can respond to threats. I used to say, you'd have to find the needles in the haystack of what looks suspicious and then go fix what you find. And I had a client somewhat politely inform me that he said, well, you're not really trying to find needles in a haystack. You're trying to find needles in the needle stack because everything looks bad. I said, touche, you're exactly right. So how do organizations do this today? And this is just table stakes, right? This isn't the modernization part of it. So the way everybody does this today is you start by collecting, normalizing, correlating, reporting, and monitoring on logs. Right? And so we pull all that data together. There's lots of different sources that are being pulled in here, and we cross-reference and normalize and see what's going on. Now, logs are just the starting point, though, because, of course, that's just looking at stuff that's already happened somewhere out there. So where almost every organization then migrates is also looking at real-time network flow analytics. Some people even go as far as calling this network detection response, or NDR. So you can see that, for example, if you have a contractor and your typical contractor downloads 3 confidential documents a week, and all of a sudden you have a contractor downloading 300 confidential documents, Flow Analytics allows you to get there and figure out that that's happening in real time. And then where most organizations then is go up to user behavior analytics, because that's where you get to then add in what are actual people and what are specific identities doing, and are 95% of our problems coming from the actions of a single user, for example. And then, as IT is transforming, we essentially get into hybrid cloud. And this is the source of some of the physics issues that I was referring to, and I'll get to that in a moment. Now, so once an organization works on being able to process all of these things for finding the needles in the needle stack, then, of course, where we go is, how do you actually respond to those threats? And unfortunately, most studies still show that the vast majority of organizations still have not defined and tested incident response playbooks or runbooks for the major events they're worried about. So I'm going to write the default state as a null set. I was a math minor in college and I like math symbols. That means that most organizations are making up their incident response playbooks after something happens. And it doesn't take a social psychologist to point out that the worst time to come up with a collaborative plan is when everybody's running around pointing fingers at each other. So the way to improve that is first to grow awareness outside of just the cyber team, that security really is everyone's job. And that's where things like cyber ranges come in really handy. And then ultimately not only defining, but automating the incident response playbooks, okay? That's how the typical threat management organization works today, and what they seek to do is, how do we continually get more mature of how we're doing this, okay? So that's just the way it exists today. However, when an organization is migrating to hybrid cloud and leveraging AI more, as I said, there's some physics issues that cause cybersecurity teams to have to modernize. And in threat management, the first of the 2 use cases I'm going to take you through, there are 3 ways that cyber teams are modernizing. The first one is based on the stark reality, and it's amazing that nobody was really thinking about this until about 1.5 or 2 years ago. But all of our threat detection activities are generally reactive. What I mean by that is that all these different sources, right, coming into our detect, our generally SIM technology to do security analytics, is responding to signals of things happening to us right now. So in other words, bluntly, we're not really looking for attackable surfaces until they're getting attacked. And then we're trying to find out as quick as possible what's going on. So that obviously leads to the obvious question, which is, why don't we get proactive about looking for attackable surfaces and then protecting those surfaces before anyone does attack them? So that's the first of the three trends in cyber modernization for threat management, is the fact that what we're realizing that we need to do now is not only do it the way we've been doing it, but we also need to identify the attack surface proactively. So we go from reactive only into proactive. And what the term everybody's using these days is attack surface management for the right reasons, right? And then lock down and protect the most attacked surfaces, starting with endpoints. And of course, most organizations will have some kind of EDR tooling in place today, but what we're finding is there's some Achilles heels to most of those tools, such as the fact that the malware is getting smarter, and if it sees it's being watched, then what it'll do is it won't fire, right, while it's being watched by the EDR tool. So what we see is the need for greater stealth. For example, running EDR as a hypervisor as opposed to in the operating system. And then this is one of many, many areas where AI is a huge plus. Because, for example, a lot of EDR tools essentially operate on signatures. And, of course, the malware is constantly evolving. And so if you use an AI engine, then you can actually detect new strains live and protect live, right? So this ability to get proactive about finding the attack surface and about protecting the surfaces, not only endpoints, also transactions, devices, and stuff like that. That is the first of three ways that cyber teams are modernizing their threat management. You have to get proactive. The second way cyber teams are modernizing is literally following the lead of what IT and our agile DevOps teams and organizations are doing, and that's building cyber on an open platform. Now, what do I mean by that? So let me show you this, because this is actually pretty dramatic. What I mean by that is that when you look at the typical cyber tools today, every cyber tool has functionality that you use to do this cool cyber protection stuff, whatever it happens to be. And then underneath that tool is some kind of built-in infrastructure that the vendor had to build in, like a data store and stuff like that. So as you grow and perform and do more with it, it grows and performs with you. And so development shops have to not only build the functionality that you care about, but it also has to build and maintain that infrastructure code in each and every solution that you use. So when you think of the terms technical debt, the typical organization has dozens of cyber tools that has this functionality you want and this infrastructure underneath that has to be improved and updated and stuff as usage grows, et cetera. So what we realized a couple of years ago is that as organizations move to hybrid cloud and kind of have a greater AI focus, is that we should be building new cyber functionality on top of the open platform of course, Docker and Kubernetes. In our case, of course, for starting with Red Hat OpenShift, since it's enterprise grade Kubernetes, and being able to actually get rid of having to write that code underneath each app. And what it does is that it frees development shops to innovate a lot faster. And what it allows our clients to do is that instead of, when there's a new functionality coming in, instead of putting in another thing of technical debt, instead you just turn on and off microservices, right? Leveraging the scalable elastic platform underneath it. So open platform, building this stuff on an open platform has become an absolutely huge thing. Not only writing cyber as microservices running on Docker and Kubernetes, but also leveraging other open standards such as ClickHouse for scalable elastic database underneath the solutions, right? So that's the second way cyber teams are modernizing, is shifting towards microservices, which are just far easier to consume and far easier to innovate on faster. Now, that's the second one. So it's getting proactive, and secondly, moving to an open platform. And then the third one is kind of the, icing on the cake. It's the big thing. And the big thing is that as cyber teams start modernizing by getting proactive and building in an open platform, then there is some net benefit, which is very measurable, to our security analysts. In particular, we see analyst acceleration, meaning security analysts are able to do things much faster than they've done before. And there's two particular innovations in the industry that we've helped spearhead that have had a dramatic impact. The first one is called Federation, and the second one is Unified Workflow. What are these things? Well, remember I said at the beginning, there's some physics problems as you move to hybrid cloud. Here's one of the fundamental ones, is that as your organization starts deploying workloads in one or more cloud providers, then obviously you're going to start generating cyber relevant information in one or more clouds. And as you do that, of course, what everybody says is, I know what to do with that data. I'm going to go over here to the detect bubble, and I'm just going to constantly pull that data into whatever, I'm using for SIEM to evaluate that stuff. The problem there, of course, is twofold. Number one is that the cloud business model is to have you move more to it, not take off of it. So the cloud providers charge you an egress charge to pull that data off of the cloud to pull it into your local tooling. And depending on what local tooling you're using, you have to pay an ingress charge, to ingest that data. So in essence, to do what we've done for the last 20 years in the cyber industry, which is pull everything into that one place, is that you're signing up for potentially a double tax that's only going to get larger and larger, right? I've heard CFOs say to CISOs in the past, you're not really thinking clearly. I'm not going to give you approval to do that. And so what happens is the physics of it is you start to do some unnatural acts. We see some clients that'll say, well, I'm just not going to collect all that data because I don't want to pay that egress charge. Or they'll say, I'll pre-process it on the cloud platform and then send it down. But then you lose a lot of the richness of the data that the SIEM tool, at least if it's a good one, can do a lot of analysis on. So that's causing a serious problem across the industry right now. What federation means is federated search and federated investigation. When you see an indicator of compromise, what you're able to do is, instead of having to pull that data from the cloud, instead you can just query it. You don't have to move it. And then you do a real-time investigation. So your investigations are faster, and you completely eliminate those basically permanent taxes, the egress and ingest charges, right? So that's federation. So that's one radical thing that is all about cyber modernization. The second one is unified workflow. And one of the things we discovered is that when you start doing federated investigations, you're able to actually build a workflow from proactive detection, confirmation, kicking off playbooks. You can all do that as a unified workflow. And because you're able to query what other tools are seeing, instead of having to run around and check each tool for what they're seeing on something, you see it all on a single console. So you have a unified workflow and a unified GUI by which you can see what all the tools are seeing. All right? So that's the first of the two major parts of what I'm to share. Cyber modernization and threat management is all about getting proactive about attack surface management and protection. Secondly is going to an open platform, so you shift from building technical debt constantly and have to integrate stuff all the time to just going to turning on and off microservices on an elastic platform. And then finally is we're able to literally accelerate how the analysts do their job through federation and unified workflow. So that's the first of the two. Now let's talk about the second major area that is seeing big changes from cyber modernization, and that is data protection. Oftentimes our conversations with cyber organizations is data security is always important, but it's usually kind of 20% discussion, maybe 30%, and 60-70 is on threat management. And we've seen a big change, in part because of increased regulations, in part because there's a lot of war stories out there, right, of data getting compromised across hybrid cloud and stuff like that. So data protection, we're also seeing a massive change, because as organizations go to hybrid cloud, what it's doing is essentially accentuating problems that were already there, but we had figured out in the past. Organizations had figured out in the past how to put in compensating controls to address the problem. You know, a big example of this is that I've seen a couple of studies on what percentage of organizations are confident they know where all their sensitive data is in a hybrid cloud deployment. And the numbers that I've seen are between 7 and 30% are confident they know where all their sensitive data is. And my typical conversation with a CISO or a CSO is, whenever I share that statistic, they'll laugh and say, yeah, and that's 7 to 30% are lying. Right? We know it's an ongoing issue. So once you go to hybrid cloud, whereas you may have been able to put compensating controls before around data protection when it was all on-prem, once you go to hybrid cloud, you kind of lose that control, especially if you have agile DevOps teams putting out workloads that sometimes you're not even fully aware of, right? So what is happening there? Well, what we're seeing is the way cyber teams are modernizing their data protection is by focusing on a discrete set of controls that allow them to do the following. How do you make sure that only the right users have only the right access to only the right data for only the right reason? In all the projects that we're doing with clients, what we're seeing is that there is a coordinated set of controls for hybrid cloud data protection, with some cool innovation that I'm going to share with you here, of making sure that you have both the IAM, the Identity and Access Management System, as well as the data protection beyond it, all working together to do this well. So let me take you briefly through what are the controls that we see most organizations focused on, and what are the innovations that are essentially the modernized way of doing data protection. So first of all, how do you make sure that only the right users can come in? What everybody starts with is governance, right? Identity governance. Who has access to what? Because look, if you don't know who has access to what, how can you do anything else, right? The second thing that we see everybody focused on right now is privileged account management. You know, somehow 20 years after Sarbanes-Oxley, this is still a major problem, but it comes from the fact that PAM is not simple. The technologies are really good out there to do it, but getting the processes and getting a whole organization to work together well to implement it across the board has always been a tough act. And so the typical shop we walk into will have some privileged account management, but spotty deployment. But now that we're seeing like cyber insurance providers, a lot of them now will not reissue or renew a policy if you don't have PAM across the board. That's driving a ton of attention here, right? And then ultimately where you want to get to here is identity analytics. And what this means is it's kind of like an identity posture thing. You say, who has access to what, but does that really make sense, right? So we see a lot of activity of focusing on controls to be able to do this. Then the next thing is I'm letting the right users in. How do I make sure they only get the right access? Of course, I mean, for 20 plus years, right? The whole idea of access management has been fundamental and continues to be in the industry. But the white hot piece for modernizing this part of it is what a lot of people are calling adaptive access. And what is adaptive access? It essentially is multi-factor authentication, MFA, on steroids, right? What do I mean by that? So typical MFA tool, Bob's on the same laptop, configured in the same way, from the same location that he's connected to me the last 250 times. So when he comes in for the 251st time, that sounds like a low risk thing. However, if you pull in a lot of fraud detection algorithms that have been developed over the years, especially in the financial services industry, you can detect that, well, but if you look at Bob's typing rate and his error rate in his typing, Bob, that might not be Bob. we need to do some step-up authentication there. So adaptive access is all about essentially advanced ways of applying MFA. So you start looking behaviorally at what's going on out there in real time. And so that's really cool. Then once we've got the right users getting the right access, then we get to the right data. And remember, the 7 to 30%, are they lying that they actually are confident they know where all their sensitive data is? There's 3 pieces that have gotten white hot very quickly here. The first, which has been around a while, is how do you identify sensitive data across a hybrid cloud environment, right? So it's discovering classification, but it's doing it consistently, including reaching into not only on-prem and hybrid cloud environments, but also into cloud-native apps. This has been a blind spot for everybody for a while. It's how do you detect if someone's taken a copy because they had legitimate access to a piece of sensitive data, but then they put it, for example, in a Slack message and sent it to some people who weren't supposed to have access to it. Nobody said visibility to that. So the ability to do identification of sensitive data, even into SaaS apps, has become huge. And then the second piece, which has also gotten huge very quickly, is posture. What does this mean? What does data security posture mean? There's a new term that's being bandied about a lot, and rightfully so, called DSPM, Data Security Posture Management. And what DSPM is all about is not only do I know where the sensitive data is, but then who can access that data? Irregardless if they're accessing it yet, who can actually look at that data, and does that make sense? And then third is who's actually looking at it. So once again, find the sensitive data anywhere, including in apps. Look at who can get access to it. The posture, essentially, is that good or bad, or do we have to make changes? And then who's actually looking at it? So this whole idea of data security posture management, once again, has gotten hot very, very quickly for obvious reasons. And then once you find it, you got to protect it, right? So let's protect that sensitive data. That includes data level access control. It includes data encryption, of course, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So being able to do this one is so white hot right now, it's not even funny. So that's a huge one. And then let's get to the last piece. Make sure the right users get only the right access to only the right data for only the right reason. What does that mean? Well, I've seen for decades, I've been doing cyber for almost 3 decades now. And as I've worked with clients on this, everybody would like to look at access to sensitive data over long periods of time, but most don't, because it takes a lot of storage space and they don't have the algorithms really to check it. But looking at access to sensitive data over a long period of time has always been something that people have wanted to do, and yet few do. And so I'm going to start with another null set here because few people do this. What we see people wanting to do is look at things like, how can I detect insider threat activity by looking at what's happening with access to sensitive data? And then ultimately, because we're seeing this acute problem in most shops, that with increasing regs, the amount of time that the teams are having to spending to prove compliance, adherence to regulations, is starting to get out of control in some places. And so not only being able to detect things like insider threat, but then also being able to automatically generate compliance reporting and stuff like that, right? So that has become a big deal. So this is what's happening out there around modernizing data protection. It's around getting our act together on identity management better. It's getting into looking at the data security posture, not only protecting it, but also including that, obviously. And then looking at access to sensitive data over long periods of time so you can find things that, frankly, you missed the first time, okay? So at IBM, we have been investing around addressing this stuff for 3 or 4 years because we saw this coming, right? IBM is a hybrid cloud and an AI company. So not only are we addressing the hybrid cloud stuff that comes up, but we're also infusing AI, right? We made our major announcement of our Watson X platform, and we are infusing AI across almost every piece that you see up here in our technologies that we've done to do this. So that's what we're seeing happening to cybersecurity programs, how they're really being driven to modernize as the organizations around them are modernizing to hybrid cloud and leveraging AI much more. So it's modernizing how we do threat management, getting proactive about finding the attack surface and protecting the surfaces rather than wait till someone attacks them. And then secondly is moving to an open platform so you get all the advantages of innovation and integration and scalability and performance. And then ultimately enable your security analysts to accelerate what they do through federated search and investigation as well as a unified workflow. And then on data protection, making sure that you have an integrated view of both identity and access management as well as data security, including proactively and constantly identifying, discovering the sensitive data, checking its posture, who can get access to it, does it make sense, who's accessing it, does it make sense, right? Protecting that data through encryption and data level access control, et cetera, and then also looking at data usage over long periods of time to be able to detect problems like insider threat, and ultimately being able to automate compliance reporting as much as possible so our teams aren't just stuck on that all the time. That's what's going on with cyber today. That's something that we're very passionate about, that we've invested a lot in to address. And so thank you for your time. If you like this video and want to see more like it, please like and subscribe. If you have questions, please drop them in the comments below.